In this lecture, I want to provide a brief history of US-EU data transfer frameworks. There are 4 frameworks that we're going to talk about. These are the Data Protective Directive, the Safe Harbor Agreement, the EU-US Privacy Shield, and the EU-US Data Privacy Framework. We will then talk about data transfer requirements, and there are 3 of them that you need to know about. These are adequacy decision, appropriate safeguards, and derogation. One final note here at the top. At the time of recording, the CIPP US does not include the EU-US Data Privacy Framework. This is a relatively new framework. This framework replaced the EU-US Privacy Shield. On this timeline, we can see a summary of the major events that mark the history of data transfer frameworks. For the purposes of the CIPP US, our timeline begins in 1995 with the Data Protective Directive. This was superseded in 2000 by the Safe Harbor Agreement. The most recent EU-US data transfer frameworks have been tainted by the Edward Snowden revelations, which we're going to talk about and provide some context to. These events took place between 2013 and 2015. In 2016, the EU-US Privacy Shield was put in place. It was short-lived, however, as the Schrems II case in 2020 ruled it null and void. And in 2022, we had the enactment of the EU-US Data Privacy Framework, which holds unto today. It's important to understand who Edward Snowden is, because it's his revelations that play a key role in informing Schrems I. Edward Snowden was a U.S. National Security Agency contractor who in 2013 leaked classified information. These revelations revealed the scope of global surveillance taking place with the cooperation of major telecommunications companies. These revelations led Max Schrems, an Austrian activist and lawyer, to bring a case to the Court of Justice of the European Union, alleging that the Snowden revelations suggested that Facebook was violating the EU's data protection rights. Schrems I and the CJEU, again that's an acronym for Court of Justice of European Union, invalidated the Safe Harbor Agreement. Succeeding Safe Harbor was the Privacy Shield, and there are 2 terms that you need to know related to the Privacy Shield. These are Standard Contractual Clause, or SCC, and Binding Corporate Rule, BCR. SCCs are a contractual promise by U.S. companies that they will adhere to EU law and to DPA, or Data Protection Authority, supervision. Binding corporate rules permit data transfer following DPA certification. Following the enactment of the Privacy Shield, however, Schrems again went to the CJEU and argued that the SCCs were invalid and questioned the legality of standard contractual clauses. Again, his argument here is that Facebook's transfer of data was violating EU data protection rights. While the CJEU ruled that standard contractual clauses were valid, the Court of Justice ruled the Privacy Shield invalid. And so Schrems II rendered the data transfer framework, this one, the Privacy Shield, null and void. With regards to data transfer between the EU and the US, there are several data transfer requirements. Now, up until now, we've talked about the EU, the European Union, and we'll define the European Union in an upcoming lecture. Another geographical entity that we need to know about is the EEA, and this stands for the European Economic Area. The EEA is constituted by 4 territories. In addition to the European Union, the EEA includes Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. In short, the transfer from the EEA to non-EEA or international organizations is prohibited unless there is in place an adequacy decision, appropriate safeguards, such as a standard contractual clause or a binding corporate rule, or a derogation. And here, derogation means explicit consent. There are exceptions for data transfer, such as when data travels from one EEA member to another via a non-EEA country. In the next 3 slides, we are going to define what an adequacy decision is, what entails appropriate safeguards, and what a derogation is. These are all 3 important terms you need to know for the CIPP US. An adequacy decision is made when EU law deems certain protections as adequate. As of 2020, neither the US nor Canada had full adequacy, and therefore data transfers were only permitted under certain circumstances. Appropriate safeguards are legally binding and include enforceable instruments, codes of conduct, and certification mechanisms. They also include the use of EU DPA adopted data protection contractual clauses. Again, DPA here stands for Data Protection Authority. We're going to define that in an upcoming lecture. And DPA authorized administrative arrangements. These all fall under appropriate safeguards. Derogation is explicit consent and is provided when transfer is necessary for a contractual or legal basis and the transfer is occasional, for public or legitimate interest, in interest of a data subject unable to consent, or when made from public register. And here, public register means materials available to the public or to those with a legitimate interest in the materials. In this lecture, we have provided a brief overview of the EU-US data transfer frameworks. These include the Data Protective Directive, the Safe Harbor Agreement, the EU-US Privacy Shield, and the EU-US Data Privacy Framework. In addition to these 4 frameworks, you also need to know the role that Snowden and Schrems played in the invalidation of these frameworks. We then discussed the 3 data transfer requirements for transferring data from the US to the EU and vice versa. These include adequacy decision, appropriate safeguards, and derogation. We then discussed the 3 data transfer requirements for transferring data from the EU to the US. These are adequacy decision, appropriate safeguards, and derogation.